The encounter. It was a calm, quiet evening in the city, and the streets were mostly empty. The sound of distant traffic echoed through the air. Two police officers, Officers Harris and Dawson, cruised through the quiet neighborhoods, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. They had been working long shifts, their patience thin, and they were looking for something to break the monotony. As they passed by a small alley, they spotted a tall, handsome black man walking down the sidewalk. His confident stride caught their attention immediately. He was dressed in simple clothes, jeans, and a jacket, but there was something about him that stood out. His calm demeanor, despite the late hour, made him seem out of place. Officer Harris glanced over at Dawson. "Let's check him out," he muttered, his voice low. Dawson nodded, and they pulled the car over to the side of the road. They waited for the man to walk closer. The air felt thick with anticipation, though neither officer could explain why. As the man walked past the car, Officer Harris stepped out, blocking his path. "Hey, you," Harris called out sharply. The man stopped, looking up with a slight raise of his brow, as if surprised by the interruption. "Can I help you, officer?" The man asked calmly, his voice steady and deep. His eyes met Harris with a calm, almost challenging look. "You're out here late, aren't you? What's your business around here?" Harris asked, trying to sound authoritative. Dawson stood behind him, watching quietly. The man's expression remained unchanged, but he seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "I'm just walking home, officer. Is there a problem?" Harris didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the man, trying to read him, looking for any sign of nervousness or a reason to justify questioning him further. Dawson, noticing the tension growing, took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Let's see some ID," Dawson ordered. His tone was more forceful now, though the man's calmness was starting to unsettle him. The man slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. As he handed it over, his eyes locked with Dawson's. There was no sign of fear, no hint of discomfort, just calm. Dawson felt a little uneasy, but pushed it aside. Officer Harris took the ID and glanced at it quickly. "Jason Carter," he read aloud. "That's a nice name, Jason, but I don't like the look of you. Where are you headed?" Jason didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered between the two officers, his posture still relaxed. "Like I said, I'm just walking home," he repeated. His voice was polite but firm. Something about his calmness was getting under Harris's skin. He had dealt with plenty of people on the streets, but there was something about Jason that felt different. The way he carried himself, like he didn't care about the officer's authority. "Why don't you step over here for a minute?" Harris said suddenly, motioning toward the back of the car. "We need to search you." Jason's eyes narrowed slightly, but his face remained calm. He took a small step back, assessing the situation. "Do you have a reason to search me, officer?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but firm. Officer Harris felt his irritation rising. "We don't need a reason. You're acting suspicious, and I'm telling you to step over here," he snapped. He could feel his control slipping as Jason stood there, still calm and unbothered. Jason glanced at Dawson, who was still standing behind Harris. Dawson met his gaze but said nothing. Then, in a quick move, Jason stepped to the side, avoiding Harris's outstretched hand. That's when everything changed. Harris, his patience gone, grabbed Jason's arm roughly and pulled him towards the car. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Harris yelled, his anger flaring up. "You don't get to walk away from me." Jason was startled but didn't resist. He let Harris pull him, but his expression remained composed, calm. Dawson stepped forward, unsure of what to do, but Harris was already too far gone. The situation had escalated too quickly. "Stop resisting," Harris shouted, now pulling harder on Jason's arm. The tension in the air was thick. Dawson, seeing how aggressive Harris had become, moved to help. Jason, still calm, turned his head to look at Dawson. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice almost too calm for the situation. But the words had no effect. Dawson grabbed Jason's other arm and held it tightly. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Dawson asked, his voice tight with frustration. "You're not in control here." Jason didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes told a different story. He was clearly angry now, but not afraid. He didn't seem to care about the two officers or their authority. They pushed him toward the back of the car, and as Harris turned to open the door, Jason spoke again. "I don't think you know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice low but clear. Harris froze, his hand on the door handle. Dawson looked at him, confused. The moment was hanging in the air, and neither officer knew what to do next. The man they had decided to take down so easily had just dropped a bombshell. Who was this man? Why was he so calm in the face of their aggression? Harris and Dawson exchanged a quick, uncertain look. For the first time, they started to wonder if they had made a mistake. Look, what did Jason mean? And who exactly was he that made him so calm under pressure? Was there more to him than they could see? The secret revealed. The tension in the air was palpable. Officers Harris and Dawson stood frozen, staring at Jason, who stood with an air of quiet defiance. His calm, unwavering demeanor was starting to unsettle them. Harris felt a surge of frustration. He had done this hundreds of times before, stopping people, questioning them, asserting his authority. But this time was different. This man wasn't afraid. "What do you mean? You don't know who you're dealing with?" Officer Harris demanded, trying to regain some control over the situation. His voice had lost its earlier certainty, now sounding more like an attempt to cover up his uncertainty. Jason didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, eyes scanning the officers, as if he was weighing them. Dawson, still holding Jason's arm, could feel the calm intensity radiating from him. It was unsettling. "I mean exactly what I said," Jason replied, his voice smooth and controlled. "You have no idea who I am. And if you did, you'd think twice about what you're doing right now." Harris's frustration grew. He had no patience for this kind of talk. "You're under arrest. You can explain yourself to the judge," he snapped. But even as he said the words, something didn't sit right. Jason's eyes softened just slightly. He could see that Harris wasn't as confident as he was trying to appear. The doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. "You don't want to do this," Jason said calmly, his voice almost a whisper now. "You don't know what you're about to get into." Dawson looked at Harris, unsure. He had been with Harris on numerous stops, but never had things escalated like this. Never had a person spoken to them like this, with such calm authority. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Then it happened. Harris's radio crackled to life, breaking the charged silence. The voice on the other end was sharp and urgent. "Harris, Dawson, get back to headquarters. We've got an urgent situation." The officers exchanged a quick look. Harris scowled, but there was something in the dispatcher's tone that made him hesitate. They had been out here for hours, and this wasn't how they planned to spend the rest of their shift. "I'm busy here," Harris said into the radio. There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice came back, even more insistent. "You don't understand. This is serious. We've been told to alert you. Be careful with the man you've stopped." The word hung in the air, and for a moment both officers were silent. Dawson looked at Jason, who was now standing perfectly still, his face unreadable. "Are you serious?" Harris muttered into the radio, disbelief creeping into his voice. The dispatcher's voice was grim. "Yes, you need to leave him alone. He's not who you think he is." Harris turned to Dawson, his face tightening with confusion and frustration. "What's going on?" he muttered under his breath. But Dawson couldn't answer. He was still staring at Jason, and for the first time, he felt like he had misjudged the entire situation. Jason's eyes flicked from Harris to Dawson, and he gave them a small, almost pitying smile. "Told you," he said softly. For a moment, neither officer moved. They had been told to back off, but neither could understand why. Why would someone give them this warning? Why was Jason so important that even their dispatcher seemed worried about them? "I don't know what you're talking about," Harris muttered, trying to regain control. He turned to Dawson, his face hardening. "Let him go. We've got bigger things to deal with." Dawson hesitated. He had never seen Harris so rattled before. Reluctantly, he released his grip on Jason's arm. Stepping back a few paces, Jason straightened up, his expression never changing. There was no fear in his eyes, only the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly what was happening. Harris stood there, staring at Jason, trying to make sense of everything. But the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. What was it that made this man so important? Why had he been treated with so much caution, even by their dispatcher? Before he could say anything else, Jason turned and started walking away. He didn't hurry, just walked at a steady pace, as if nothing had happened. Dawson and Harris watched him leave, both feeling a strange unease settle in their chests. Harris wanted to follow him, but the dispatcher's warning still echoed in his mind. "Be careful." As Jason disappeared into the night, the two officers were left standing in silence, uncertainty filling the air. Neither of them had any idea just how much trouble they had narrowly avoided. The unexpected revelation. The following morning, the events from the night before weighed heavily on Officer Harris's mind. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the papers in front of him. Every time he tried to focus on the paperwork, his mind kept drifting back to Jason. Who was that man? Why had he seemed so untouchable, so sure of himself? Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Jason than just a random person walking through the streets. As Harris sat deep in thought, his radio crackled to life again, pulling him from his reverie. "Harris, we need you at the station. Now." The urgency in the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Harris stood up immediately, leaving his papers behind as he grabbed his jacket. Dawson, who had been at the station since the morning, was waiting outside. The two exchanged a glance before heading to the squad car. "Something's going on," Dawson said as they drove. His voice was tight with anxiety. He, too, had been thinking about Jason all night. "We'll find out soon enough," Harris muttered, trying to hide his growing unease. His gut told him they hadn't heard the last of Jason. And this time, it felt like they were about to get answers. But would they be ready for what they learned? The ride to the station felt longer than usual, the silence between the two men thick with anticipation. As they pulled into the parking lot, they were met by Sergeant Miller, who looked more serious than they had ever seen him. "Harris, Dawson," Miller said, his voice tight. "You two need to sit down." Harris exchanged a nervous glance with Dawson before they followed Miller into the briefing room. Once inside, Miller closed the door behind them and turned to face them, his expression grim. "I don't know how to say this, so I'm going to be blunt," Miller began. "Last night, you guys pulled over a man named Jason Blackwell." Harris's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard the name before, but it sounded oddly familiar. Jason Blackwell. He felt a strange sense of recognition that he couldn't explain. "I know you didn't think much of him," Miller continued, "but you need to know something. Jason Blackwell is not just anyone. He's not some random guy off the street." Miller paused, waiting for the information to sink in. Harris and Dawson exchanged confused glances, unsure of where this was going. "You both have no idea who he is," Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I do." He turned to his computer, typing in a few commands. A moment later, he turned the screen toward them. Harris and Dawson leaned in, staring at the image of Jason that appeared on the monitor. The man they had encountered the previous night looked almost ordinary. But as Harris stared at the image, something about Jason's eyes seemed different. There was an intensity, a power behind them that was unmistakable. "That's him," Miller said quietly. "Jason Blackwell, the son of one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country." Harris blinked, trying to process the information. "Wait, what?" he asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "You're telling me he's the son of some billionaire?" "Not just any billionaire," Miller replied. "His father is one of the most influential people in the world. Blackwell Enterprises is everywhere. The company has its hands in tech, finance, real estate, you name it." Dawson's eyes widened in shock. "So, he's a billionaire's son." He repeated the words, as if to make sure he understood correctly. Miller nodded slowly. "That's right. And you two nearly arrested him last night. Do you have any idea how much trouble that could have caused?" Harris's mind raced. He remembered how Jason had spoken. So calm, so sure of himself. And now it made sense. He hadn't been just some random person. He had been someone who could make things happen. Someone who had power beyond what they could ever imagine. But why had Jason been out there, in the streets, acting so normal? Why hadn't he used his father's influence to avoid the situation altogether? As if reading his thoughts, Miller spoke again. "It's not just about money or power. Jason has a lot of people looking out for him. And if you think this is over, you're wrong. You've stirred up something much bigger than you realize." The weight of Miller's words settled on them like a heavy blanket. Harris's mind raced. He had no idea what they had gotten themselves into. But one thing was clear. They had underestimated Jason, and now they were about to find out just how far his influence reached. Harris's phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message that made his heart race. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You're on the wrong side of this, officer. Stay away from Jason Blackwell, or there will be consequences." His pulse quickened. This was just the beginning. The warning. The air in the briefing room felt thick, almost suffocating as Harris stared at the phone in his hand. The message from the unknown number burned in his mind. "You're on the wrong side of this, officer. Stay away from Jason Blackwell, or there will be consequences." Harris' hands trembled slightly as he lowered the phone, his thoughts racing. Who had sent that message? How did they know about what had happened with Jason? It was almost like they were being watched. He glanced up at Dawson, who had been quiet ever since Miller had revealed Jason's true identity. "What do you think this means?" Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dawson's brow furrowed, and he shook his head slowly. "It's a threat, Harris. Whoever this is, they're telling us to back off. And if we don't, who knows what could happen?" Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settling in his chest. They had just learned that Jason wasn't just some random guy, but the son of one of the most powerful men in the world. And now it seemed they were tangled in something much bigger than they had ever imagined. A small part of him wondered if it had been a mistake to confront Jason in the first place, but it was too late for that now. Miller, who had been standing silently by the door, cleared his throat. The sound broke through the tension in the room like a loud snap of a twig. "We need to be careful from here on out," he said, his tone serious. "This isn't something we can just brush off. If Jason's family is involved in this, things could get ugly. And I'm not sure either of you is ready for what's coming next." The weight of Miller's words hit Harris like a punch to the gut. He had never expected something like this to happen. They had just been doing their jobs, doing what they thought was right. But now, it seemed they had opened a door that should have stayed closed. "Where do we go from here?" Dawson asked, his voice a mix of concern and curiosity. "Do we just let this go?" Miller shook his head. "You can't let it go. But you need to be smart about it. I'll contact some people who know more about the Blackwell family. They might be able to help us figure out what we're dealing with. But for now, I'm pulling you both off this case. You'll stay clear of Jason Blackwell and anything connected to him." Harris opened his mouth to protest, but Miller raised a hand to stop him. "I know you both have questions. I do too," Miller continued. "But right now, your safety is the most important thing. I don't want you two getting mixed up in something that could cost you everything." The words didn't sit well with Harris. He had always believed in doing the right thing, no matter what the cost. But now he had to admit that Miller was right. They were up against something much bigger than they realized. and they didn't know who to trust anymore. As Harris turned to leave the briefing room, his mind raced. The message he had received earlier was still haunting him. He couldn't just walk away from this. Something told him that if they let Jason slip through their fingers, it would only be a matter of time before the consequences of their actions came crashing down on them. That evening, as Harris sat at home, the phone buzzed again. It was the same unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the message. "You've been warned, officer. Don't make the mistake of underestimating us. Stay out of Jason Blackwell's life, or there will be consequences." His fingers tightened around the phone. He couldn't ignore this anymore. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't playing around, and they weren't going to let him walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. Harris leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? Jason Blackwell was not just any man. He was a force to be reckoned with. And now, Harris had unknowingly stepped into his world. As the night grew darker, Harris felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: things were about to get a whole lot more dangerous. The pressure mounts. The following morning, Harris couldn't shake the sense of unease that gripped him. The warning had been clear, and yet something inside him told him he couldn't just walk away from this. He had always prided himself on doing the right thing, no matter the danger. But now, with every passing minute, the weight of the situation was growing heavier. Dawson had left a message for him early that morning, asking to meet up. The tone was urgent, and Harris couldn't ignore it. He knew Dawson was feeling the same pressure, the same uncertainty about what to do next. As Harris entered the small coffee shop where they had agreed to meet, he spotted Dawson sitting in a corner booth, looking more tense than usual. Harris slid into the seat across from him, his mind racing with possibilities. What did Dawson have to say? What was their next move? "You see the latest news?" Dawson asked as soon as Harris sat down. There was a look of concern in his eyes. Harris shook his head. He hadn't checked the news yet. Dawson pulled out his phone and handed it to Harris. On the screen, a headline flashed: "Jason Blackwell's family continues to dominate global markets. Blackwell Enterprises reaches unprecedented deal." The article went on to describe how Blackwell Enterprises, Jason's father's company, had just secured a deal with one of the world's largest tech firms. Harris skimmed through the details. It seemed like Blackwell Enterprises was involved in everything: tech, real estate, finance, and more. The company had its hands in nearly every industry. But it wasn't the deal that caught Harris's attention. It was a small paragraph buried at the bottom of the article. Sources close to Blackwell Enterprises suggest that Jason Blackwell is poised to take a more active role in the company's future, though his presence has been largely low profile in the past. Harris's blood ran cold. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Jason wasn't just a man with a powerful father. He was about to step into the limelight himself, maybe even become the public face of the Blackwell empire. "We're dealing with something much bigger than we thought," Harris muttered, more to himself than to Dawson. Dawson nodded slowly. "Yeah, and now they're watching us. The threats we've been getting, they're not empty. Someone's making sure we stay away from Jason." The realization hit Harris like a ton of bricks. They weren't just dealing with a spoiled rich kid. They were up against a man with nearly limitless resources, someone who could make their lives miserable without breaking a sweat. And now, with his potential rise in the Blackwell empire, things were about to get even more complicated. "Do we walk away?" Dawson asked, his voice laced with hesitation. Harris took a deep breath, his mind racing. The threat was real, but so was their duty. They couldn't just sit by and let Jason Blackwell's actions go unchecked. Something about the way he carried himself, the air of arrogance and confidence, told Harris that Jason believed he was untouchable, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. "I don't think we can walk away," Harris said, his voice low. "If we do, we're letting him get away with something we don't even understand yet. But we need to be smart about this. We need to know who's behind these threats before we make our next move." Dawson stared at him, a look of both admiration and doubt in his eyes. "And what if it's too dangerous? What if we're in over our heads?" "We already are," Harris replied, the words escaping before he could stop them. "But we can't just let this go. We need answers." Just then, Harris's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was another message from the same unknown number. His heart sank as he opened the text. "You're digging too deep, officer. Walk away before it's too late. This is your last warning." The message sent a chill down Harris's spine. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear now that backing off wasn't an option. Someone didn't want them involved with Jason Blackwell. But that only made Harris more determined. He wasn't going to back down. "I don't know who these people are, but they're not going to scare me off," Harris said firmly, looking up at Dawson. "We need to find out everything we can about Jason and his father. If we can't stop them, we'll at least understand what we're dealing with." Dawson hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "I'm with you. Let's do this, Harris. But we need to be careful. The stakes are higher than we thought." The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. Harris knew they were stepping into dangerous territory, but the thought of walking away without uncovering the truth was something he couldn't live with. They had started this, and now they were going to see it through, no matter the cost. The unexpected revelation. Days passed, and the pressure on Harris and Dawson grew heavier with each passing moment. The threats kept coming, each one more direct than the last. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching their every move. They were in too deep now to back out, but the realization that they were dealing with something far bigger than just a case of police misconduct started to settle in. Harris decided it was time to confront Jason Blackwell. He had learned that Jason was frequently seen at an exclusive club downtown, a place where only the wealthy and influential had access. Harris wasn't sure how he would get in, but he was determined to face the young man who had unknowingly caused so much trouble. On the night of the confrontation, Harris stood outside the club, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Dawson stood beside him, both men scanning the area for any sign of Jason. The lights from the club's neon signs illuminated the street, casting long shadows across the pavement. There was something unnerving about the place. It felt like stepping into a different world, a world where power and money ruled everything. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Dawson whispered, his voice tinged with doubt. "No turning back now," Harris replied, his eyes still fixed on the entrance. "We've got to talk to him. If we don't, we'll never know what we're really up against." They watched as a sleek black car pulled up to the front entrance, and a well-dressed figure stepped out. Jason Blackwell. Harris's heart pounded in his chest as the young man walked confidently into the club, surrounded by his entourage. He had a cocky smile on his face, as if he owned the entire world. But Harris wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. He motioned for Dawson to follow, and the two men approached the entrance. The bouncer, a massive figure with a no-nonsense look, blocked their path. "Private event," the bouncer growled. "You're not on the list." "I'm not here for the event," Harris replied, his voice steady. "I need to speak with Jason Blackwell." The bouncer hesitated for a moment, eyeing them suspiciously. He had obviously been told to keep unwanted guests out, but there was something about Harris's tone that made him reconsider. With a curt nod, the bouncer stepped aside, allowing them to enter the club. Inside, the atmosphere was unlike anything Harris had ever experienced. The music was loud, the lights dim, and the people around him were dressed in the finest clothes money could buy. But it wasn't the luxury that caught Harris's attention. It was the feeling of power that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. This was a place where decisions were made, where lives could be ruined in an instant. They moved through the crowd, searching for Jason. Eventually, they found him in a private VIP area, seated at a table with several well-dressed individuals. He looked up when he saw them approaching, a slight smirk crossing his face. "Gentlemen," Jason said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I was wondering when you two would show up." Harris didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm. "This is bigger than what happened on that night. It's bigger than just us." Jason's smirk faded slightly, but he remained composed. He gestured for them to sit. "So, what is it you want to know?" he asked, his voice casual, as if he were discussing a business deal. "We want to know why you're involved in this," Dawson interjected. "Why did you threaten us? What's the real reason behind all of this?" Jason leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "You still don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice cold. "You're not just dealing with me. You're dealing with something much bigger. My father's empire reaches far beyond what you can imagine. I've spent my life in the shadows, watching as he built something unstoppable. And now it's my turn." Harris and Dawson exchanged a look, both stunned by Jason's words. The pieces were starting to fall into place. This wasn't just a case of police overstepping their bounds. This was about power, real, dangerous power. "You think you can just come in here and ask questions like you're still in control," Jason continued. "You have no idea what you're up against. My father's influence is everywhere. And if you keep digging, you'll regret it." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. The young man wasn't just arrogant. He was deadly serious. And the mention of his father's influence made it clear that they were in far deeper than they had ever imagined. "You're right about one thing," Harris said, standing up. "We don't know what we're up against, but we're going to find out. And when we do, you'll have to answer for your actions." Jason stood up as well, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and amusement. "You think you can take me down? You think you can take down my family?" he sneered. "You have no idea what's coming." As Harris and Dawson turned to leave, the tension in the room was palpable. The threat had been made clear. Jason Blackwell wasn't just a spoiled rich kid. He was a man who had the power to ruin lives, to destroy anyone who stood in his way. And Harris and Dawson were now in the crosshairs. The final showdown. The weight of Jason Blackwell's words lingered in the air long after Harris and Dawson had left the club. They could feel the walls closing in around them, as if they were pawns in a much larger game, one where the rules were set by people far more powerful than them. The young man's chilling words echoed in their minds. "You have no idea what you're up against." It had only been a few hours since their meeting, but Harris couldn't shake the feeling that every move they made was being watched. Every phone call they made, every step they took, felt like a calculated move in a game they didn't fully understand. What kind of man was Jason Blackwell? And what kind of empire was he a part of? The duo met in their office late that night. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the room. Harris rubbed his temples, trying to gather his thoughts. Dawson sat across from him, his hands clenched into fists. "We can't back down now, Harris," Dawson said, his voice low but firm. "We've seen enough to know that this is bigger than just some spoiled rich kid. If we don't stop this now, who knows how many more lives will be ruined." Harris nodded grimly. He knew that Dawson was right. Jason Blackwell wasn't just playing around. He was part of something that could tear their lives apart. But how were they supposed to fight back against an enemy who had everything at his disposal? How could they possibly win when the odds were stacked so high? Suddenly, Harris's phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. "Dawson, you should hear this," he said, answering the call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Detective Harris, I presume?" the voice asked, with a slight chuckle. Harris could tell it was someone who thought they were in control. "Who is this?" Harris demanded, his hand tightening on the phone. "My name is Vincent Drake," the voice replied, "and I represent Mr. Blackwell. I think it's time you understood the kind of situation you've gotten yourself into." Harris's heart raced. The name Vincent Drake wasn't one he recognized. But it didn't matter. The message was clear. Jason Blackwell wasn't just a powerful young man. He was connected to forces that could change everything. "I'm sure you've figured out by now that you're out of your depth," Drake continued, his voice smooth and menacing. "You've been poking around in places you shouldn't be. I'm offering you a way out. Step back, let it go, and you'll both walk away with your careers intact. But if you keep pushing, if you keep digging, I can promise you, things will get a lot worse for you. And for everyone you care about." Harris clenched his jaw, the threat clear as day. But there was no turning back now. The path they were on had already led them to a point of no return. "We're not backing down," Harris said firmly, his voice unwavering. "Whatever you're threatening, we'll face it, but we're going to stop Jason Blackwell. You can't silence the truth." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Harris could almost hear Drake smile, the smug satisfaction in his tone. "You think you can stop this?" Drake asked. "You think you can win against someone like Mr. Blackwell? You're naive, detective. You're playing in a game where the stakes are much higher than you realize. Your life, your careers, it's all expendable to us." Harris's stomach churned, but he stood his ground. "We'll see about that." The call ended abruptly. The silence in the room was deafening. "What now?" Dawson asked, breaking the tension. "He's not just warning us. He's threatening everything we care about. But we've come too far." Harris sat back in his chair, staring at the wall, deep in thought. He knew Dawson was right. There was no turning back now. The clock was ticking, and Jason Blackwell wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. "We find him," Harris said, determination in his voice. "We find out everything about his empire, his connections, everything. We bring the truth to light, no matter the cost." But even as the words left his mouth, a small part of Harris wondered if they were already too late. Jason Blackwell had powerful people in his corner, people who would stop at nothing to protect him. It wasn't just about exposing a spoiled heir anymore. It was about facing an entire network of influence and corruption, one that stretched far beyond anything they had ever encountered. The next morning, Harris and Dawson met with their most trusted allies in the force. They needed more than just a plan. They needed to uncover every secret, every connection that would lead them to Jason's downfall. They didn't just need evidence. They needed a way to get close to him, to break through the layers of protection that surrounded him. The investigation was risky. It would test their limits, push them into dangerous territory, but both men knew they had no choice. They couldn't let Jason Blackwell's world of power and influence continue to dominate their lives. As the days passed, Harris and Dawson began to piece together the puzzle. They followed leads, uncovered hidden documents, and took risks that no one else in their position would dare take. It became clear that Jason wasn't just a part of something dangerous. He was at the center of it, and no one would be able to stop him unless they did something drastic. The stakes had never been higher, and as Harris stood in front of his partner, ready to face whatever was coming next, he knew that there was no turning back. It was time for the final showdown, and only one side would emerge victorious.